The writer Philip K. Dick only left North America once. In 1977, he attended a conference on science fiction in France that has now become a cult event.
The subject of this speech is a topic which has been discovered recently and which may not exist at all.
While the California-based novelist almost never left his suburban home, he invented extraordinary worlds infused with science, philosophy, and religion. Since his death in 1982, the writer's legacy of no less than 45 novels and 120 short stories earned him a place beside the greatest writers such as Kafka, Orwell, or Asimov.
I may be talking about something that does not exist. Therefore, I'm free to say everything or nothing.
In his novels, Philip K. Dick blurs the line between reality and imagination, the present and the future.
Then the United States must build its strength.
Throughout his books, true visions arise: ecological disasters, artificial worlds, global surveillance, destructive or empathetic robots. Hollywood has embraced his life's work and turned many of his novels and short stories into films, such as Blade Runner, Minority Report, and Total Recall. Philip K. Dick's stories are about us, about our present and our future.
Like a lot of people, I become a fan of simply by reading one of his books. You read one of his books, you had to read all of his books. So I scoured the used bookstores of the Bay Area, and with a great deal of difficulty, I found all, or at least most, of his novels and his short story collections. I read them all, and I wrote up an essay discussing Phil's writing. And he called me out of the blue one day. I picked up the phone and said, "Hi, this is Phil Dick." He told me how much he liked my piece, and I asked him if I could interview him. So I went down to Santa Ana, California. We talked about his writing, and we talked about his life. It was just a wonderful conversation.
I was never convinced that science fiction was of less value than high literature. In fact, in high school, I was working on a science fiction story, which I still have. So I was in a curious position. I had read science fiction since I was 12 years old and was really addicted to reading it. I mean, I just loved it. And I also was reading what the Berkeley intellectual community was reading, which would be like Proust, for example, and Joyce. So I occupied two worlds right there, which normally did not intersect.
When Phil Dick was writing his work, science fiction was a very marginalized genre. People wrote for a penny or two a word. Phil would have been happy to get 2 cents a word for a lot of this fiction that he wrote in the 1950s and 60s. It was written on pulp paper, which is why they call it pulp science fiction, and had lurid covers of bug-eyed monsters, or BEMs as they were called, attacking beautifully scantily clad women. And this is where Phil found a venue for his thoughts, for his feelings about the world.
I went from high school to a full-time job in a record store and radio shop, and working 6 days a week. I didn't get a chance to do much writing. I got married when I was 19, and I suddenly began to feel that science fiction was very important. I had a mysterious quality in the universe which could be dealt with in science fiction. I realize now that what I was sensing was a kind of a metaphysical world, you know, an invisible realm of things half seen, with supernatural powers.
That was Tupper and Reed record store, and he worked there in the early 1950s. And he froze up. He had sort of like a panic attack or an agoraphobic attack, and that's what decided him, I have to write full time. So that got him out of selling records. That got him into writing fiction.
I mean, it's been a long road, but science fiction offered me a route by which I could publish the kind of thing that I wanted to write. I was reading Martian Time Slip the other night. Now that is exactly what I wanted to write. The invasion of one person's world by another person's world.
Phil began writing copious quantities of science fiction stories, and he sent them off, and he sent them off, and he got return, but eventually one sold. Rug, I believe that was his first science fiction story that he sold.
Rug, my first story, is a perfect example of what I was trying to do, and that was Jung's idea, not mine. I was showing each person with a different world, and the contents of that world consisting to a large degree of material from his own mind, in which he did not recognize as his own mind coming back at him from outside. Now this is an idea that never left me.
Now, if you look at Philip Dick's writing, you see he repeats things from novel after novel, but he varies them. A lot of his work is really, really funny. There's some really hilarious things in various of Philip Dick's novels. He never tried to write for popularity. He never tried to write a bestseller of any sort. He just wanted to write what he wanted to write. Although he aspired to write literary fiction, he tried endlessly to write literary fiction. He wrote 11 literary novels in the 1950s that were unpublished. No one would touch them.
When I purchased my first published story, somebody said to me, "Do you read that kind of stuff?" And I said, "Madam, I not only read it, I write it." And people would say to me, "Well, why don't you write something serious? Why do you write science fiction? Write something serious." By that they meant important. Nevertheless, I did as well as I could. I wrote the most profound, the most imaginative novel I could, and just floated it out into the world and hoped that eventually it would receive an audience.
Phil wrote 35 novels, 40 novels, something like that. 35 of them are good to excellent. 5 of them are duds. All right, okay, sure. That's a pretty good ratio.
Well, they're writing. It's barbarism come back again. But they smash up that infernal gun, then honor is satisfied and you needn't go.
They won't smash the gun.
One of the depressing things about cheap science fiction is it always shows the future, either a dystopia or an apocalypse, or whatever new thing has happened. You only look at a few people, the great big brother and the protagonist fighting the enemy. You never look at common people and how their lives have changed. But Philip K. Dick was different. He liked to see how average people, how their lives would be changed. Philip K. Dick didn't write horror as much as he wrote about the creepy sensation that all certainties stand upon sand. Phil Dick was not afraid of exploring his fears. This was a man who had real fears.
In hindsight now, I could say he really doesn't fit the American diagnostic criteria, because he had a little bit of everything. Certainly had a large depressive part of him. And then he had the creative side. At night in his condo writing, he was in control of his world. But when he came out of that world and had to deal with just the mundane, catch a bus, go to a restaurant, those are things he couldn't do. Definitely an agoraphobic tendency. I mean, he could just stay in his apartment if he was left alone.
Welcome to the jungle!
One of the novels that he wrote very, very quickly, as far as I understand it, was the Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, because he wrote it, again, in this hovel place at the bottom of his garden. And in it, he not only downloaded very, very quickly the idea of the storyline and everything else, but he also had experiences, like he did see a huge eye in the sky when he was walking back one day, and he then put that in his novel. So literally, he was incorporating these experiences as they were happening actually into the novel.
In the early 1960s, Phil was married to Ann Dick. And Ann had 3 daughters from her previous marriage, and the little girls who were old enough played with Barbie dolls. And he observed their play with Barbie dolls, and he used that play with Barbie dolls to inspire the way that people would play with dolls in his future world of Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch.
You make me feel my Barbie doll is really real.
The colonists on Mars used drugs to translate themselves into a virtual reality of living as dolls. And it was a way that the Martian colonists escaped from their miserable lives by playing at dolls.
Beautiful Barbie, I'll make believe that I am you.
We do know that Phil used to take a lot of illicit drugs, but mostly amphetamines. Now, I believe the concoction of drugs he was taking and the medication he was taking and the vitamin C that he was taking all facilitated the opening of his mind to see the world behind the world.
I never thought of him in terms of whether there was some brain damage. I just didn't see any of the clues that I would normally look for. Phil got there all on his own. He didn't need LSD to get there.
I was being paid so little per book that I had to turn out a very large number of books. I turned out, I think, I published 16 novels in 5 years at one point, and I had an extremely expensive wife, extremely expensive children, and I just wrote like mad, and the only way I could write that much was to take amphetamines, and these were prescribed for me. I mean, I did 60 finished pages a day. I finally stopped taking them. This is not something that I used to say in the 60s when drug taking was more popular, like I used to talk like I was really into acid, but the fact of the matter is I took acid 2 times.
Phil was 43 and I was 18, but to me he looked like a little lost puppy, and he pretty much was. He was broke, on his own, no really close attachments, and hundreds of miles from the Bay Area where he had expected to spend his whole life. He was impossible to live with, but so am I, so I guess that was a perfect match.
Women were important to Phil in the sense that he kept going back to them, but he kept picking, dying women, very ill women, flawed women.
Phil and I both wanted to disconnect from our old friends and from our families. There was too much dysfunctionality in these people who were close to us. And in particular, Phil had a problem with his mother that went back to early childhood. In some sense, he felt that she blamed him for the death of his twin sister.
Phil, throughout his life, felt that he was only half created, in the sense that part of him had died and that part of him had already been buried and was already in the grave. Now, what is intriguing about this is that he would have known that there was a grave on a hillside in Colorado waiting for his name, because the original grave that Jane was buried in 1929 actually had her name on it, and underneath it was waiting for Phil's name. And ultimately, when Phil died, he was buried with his sister.
It's a common theme in my writing that a dark-haired girl shows up at the door of the protagonist and tells him that his world is delusional, that there's something false about it. Well, this did finally happen to me. I even knew that her hair would be black. I had an actual complete sense of what she would look like and what she would say.
In his mind's eye, she was the dark-haired girl, and Phil, throughout his life, had the search for what he called the dark-haired girl. And if you look at the women in his life, they were very much of a similar type. And this is the type that he imagined Jane would have been. So he was searching for Jane all his life. He was searching for this lost sister, this emptiness in his life. And it must have made him feel instinctively lonely.
In some novels, she's Rachel. In other novels, she has other names, but she's the same pattern, the same template, the same woman.
My sister is everything to me. I am damned always to be separated from her and with her in an oscillation. I have her in me and often outside me, but I have lost her.
She did appear, she was a total stranger, and she did inform me of this fact, that some of my fictional works were in a literal sense true.
A couple of times I pushed him on family issues, his, growing up, childhood. I got some stuff. His mother was a communist. They lived in Berkeley. And if he reached a point, he stopped. And it was like, no, I'm not going to talk anymore. And it was very clear.
We are living in a computer-programmed reality, and the only clue we have to it is when some variable is changed and some alteration in our reality occurs. We would have the overwhelming impression that we were reliving the present.
Time and time again in Phil's writing, you get this simulacra. You get somebody discovering that they're a machine, not knowing that somebody's a machine. There's a classic sequence in Martian Timeslip where one of the characters is talking to the personnel manager of his mine that he's working in, and suddenly he realizes this man could be a machine, that he could almost see the cogs working. Now, this was based upon an incident in Phil's childhood when he suddenly thought that one of the teachers was an automaton.
I was looking at her one day, and she was rattling away in this high-pitched, clackety-clack, shrill voice. And suddenly I had the impression that she was not a human being, but a mechanical creature, and that all of a sudden her head would fall off and the spring would be visible. And once the idea got into my mind, I couldn't get rid of it.
Who are you? What is the essence of you? At least a dozen Philip K. Dick novels dealt with this question of what are the boundaries of the individual.
I wonder how success would have been. I mean, it was so close to his stroke and the opening of Blade Runner. He was supposed to go in the limousine with Harrison Ford that night. Talk about poetic justice in a way. And it's, if he had been the normal writer seeking fame and fortune, but I don't think that was Phil. He wrote for, like I said, different reasons to balance his life out. I can only imagine, just had he survived, how he would have handled fame.
Blade Runner, which is an official adaptation of a Philip Dick novel, inspired many other tech noir, as they're sometimes called, films such as The Terminator or The Matrix, in which technology is seen as a dark force, something that people have to struggle against.
America's first attempt to launch a satellite, a 6.5-inch sphere weighing just over 3 pounds, was checked out by scientists and declared ready. A great wave of advanced publicity focused attention at Cape Canaveral, Florida, for the launching of Test Vehicle 3 of Project Vanguard.
If you look at the popular literature and the popular television, you see the triumph of technology celebrated. Well, Phil had nothing to do with that. That was not his world.
Something had gone wrong with an automatic defense system out in space, and it was acting out its cycle this way, and no one could halt it either. It was war and death, yes, but it was error. It lacked intent. He did not feel any hostility from the forces overhead. They were not vengeful or motivated. They were empty, hollow, completely cold. It was not policy. It was breakdown and failure. Chance.
Science fiction was badly named. It should have been speculative history, because we're constantly obsessed with how history might have been different, or extending it into the future. And so, it should have been speculations about us, our great story, how it extends, as a people and as a species or as individuals. Philip K. Dick was one of the best at this. He would always explore the alternatives. What if something was different? What if the Nazis and Japanese had won World War II, for example, in his famous book, The Man in the High Castle?
One of Philip Dick's most famous novels, and certainly in his lifetime his most successful novel, was The Man in the High Castle. By the year 2014, we are all used to alternate worlds, alternate stories, alternate histories in which something happens and then everything changes and we're living in a different universe. Well, at the time that he wrote that book in the early 1960s, this was much rarer. The period he wrote in, from the early 50s to the early 80s, was a great period of American ascendancy in the world. America seemed unchallenged in terms of world dominance.
If we're going to be true to our destiny of being the great defender of freedom in these dangerous times, then the United States must build its strength. We are a great country, but I believe that we can be a greater country.
Philip Dick presented the United States that was defeated. Genuinely defeated and genuinely occupied. It was not like the usual sort of occupation fantasies in which there's a resistance who are fighting against the evil occupiers, which is something that we like to think of. You know, if the Nazis take over, if the communists take over, if the robots take over, there's always going to be somebody fighting against the power. In Philip Dick's world, there is no resistance.
Maybe the Goebbels government will fall after all, he thought, as he was ushered into the waiting SS Daimler staff sedan. But what does it matter? Even if Dr. Goebbels is deposed and Operation Dandelion is canceled, they will still exist. The black shirts, the Partei, The schemes, if not in the Orient, then somewhere else. On Mars and Venus, we can only hope and try. We do not have the ideal world, such as we would like, where morality is easy because cognition is easy, where one can do right with no effort because he can detect the obvious.
He wanted to show that what the Nazis did in World War II was not unique, and it could happen anywhere at any time, and more specifically in the United States after President Kennedy was assassinated.
At 1:25, the motorcade moves into the downtown area. Death is 6 minutes away.
Phil was a very empathic human being, and unlike most of us, when something bad happened, he reacted to it very strongly. And he understood the impact with Kennedy's assassination, with Sadat's assassination. He recognized that blood would flow.
Anti-war demonstrators protest U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War in mass marches, rallies, and demonstrations. Central Park is the starting point for the parade to the UN building. The estimated 125,000 Manhattan marchers include students, housewives, beatnik poets, doctors, businessmen, teachers, priests, and nuns.
Phil was very much against the actions in both Korea and Vietnam. They were called police actions because they were not declared wars, but they were wars, and they were hell. And he signed a petition in Ramparts magazine promising not to pay any income taxes till our troops came home from Vietnam. And that might be why he came to the attention of certain authorities who did not like him very much.
Police once told me that I was a crusader and they had no use for crusaders. But unfortunately, they didn't tell me what I was crusading for. I was afraid to ask what it was I was a crusader for. And they told me that if I did not get out of the county, I would be shot in the back or worse some night. And I merely took their advice. I left the United States and went to Canada for a while. But I never found out what I was crusading for. It may have had something to do with my writing.
I don't think he was overtly paranoid, but highly suspicious. He didn't trust the government. He had gone through a police raid, I guess, with the Black Panthers in Oakland, and was walking the far left-wing side during, or leading up to the war. So he had some real concrete reasons to not be, especially in terms of the government.
Phil and I had a poster at one time that said, "Just because I'm paranoid doesn't mean you are not out to get me." And in a sense, that's quite true.
My house was broken into, my files were blown open, my papers were stolen. I've seen my CIA file, I've seen my FBI file.
Except that in the house, when I check the storage drums of the holo scanners, I'll pretty well know pretty soon what everyone in my house is doing, and when they do it, and probably even why, myself included. I will watch all the rooms on a 24-hour basis.
Make sure they don't have a closed-circuit TV surveillance system. You'll find cameras are usually located over each entrance. You'll find them in other areas, too, like where expensive articles are on display.
Phil did seem to be warning us through his writing about the control of the state and how the state is controlling us more and more, how we are being watched all the time. Phil was giving warnings. Now, the question is, did Phil know that he was given warnings there, or was he a form of cipher?
In my recent novel, A Scanner Darkly, a narcotics agent winds up reporting on himself turning over information on himself to his higher-ups.
Philip Dick presented a world in which all authority figures lie to us all the time. So you see that in novel after novel, and story after story. And I think he was trying to warn us. You know, he was sitting away in his little room, typing away, and he was giving us a warning. He's giving us a sending. He's giving us, I guess, the equivalent of an I Ching reading of our future world and saying, folks, don't do this. If Philip Dick were alive and writing today, I think he'd be appalled at how much of his dark vision of the future had come true. What with the surveillance society, what with the collapse of the ecology. In The Penultimate Truth, he presents a world in which humanity is hiding underground. Humanity has been told that an atomic war has broken out.
People are kept underground to make robots, not as soldiers to fight the war, which ended after a brief battle, but actually to have robot servants for the elite who live above ground in vast landed estates, because the world is not really polluted and it's a lie.
The big lie is that the atomic war has broken out and that the world's surface is an ash heap and everyone has to hide and live underground. Well, you have the big lie of the Iraq War. You have the big lie of all the lies that are being poured out constantly by our government and other governments around the world down to the present time.
The gravity of this moment is matched by the gravity of the threat that Iraq's weapons of mass destruction pose to the world.
Look at me. Look at me. Positive for Howard Marks. Mr. Marks, by mandate of the District of Columbia Pre-Crime Division, I'm placing you under arrest for the future murder of Sarah Marks and Donald Dubin that was take place today, April 22nd, at 0800 hours, 4 minutes.
No, I didn't do anything. Sarah!
Give the man his hand.
In Minority Report, the government finds 3 precognitive mutants who get glimpses of violence in the future and say, this person is going to commit this crime. And off the police go. And they stop the crime from happening.
37 units and 1251, 1251, AW progress, 80%.
Can predictive crime become as accurate in real life as Philip K. Dick portrayed it?
14050, just checking the vertical location.
There is a program called PredPol, Predictive Policing, in which cities, police departments are analyzing neighborhoods and traffic patterns for anything that might predict the arrival of crime. And this has already worked very well in many cities. They say that social conditions here, various other factors, mean we should have extra police in this area this weekend. And this has been a relative success.
When I implemented predictive policing for the last 12 weeks now, I've seen a steady decline in my actual property crime. So it has demonstrated to me that there is efficacy in the predictive policing, and it really is just focusing our enforcement efforts of all our police officers here assigned at Pacific to be in those specific areas. I truly believe this technology and further technology as it relates to crime reduction is really the future.
My God, my life, which is to say my 274-374 experience, is exactly the plot of any of 10 of my novels or stories, even down to fake memories and identity. I'm a protagonist from one of PKD's books. Geez, mixture of imposter, joint, and maze, if not Ubik as well.
Valis was warning us through Phil, using Phil as a medium by which we could be warned about the outcomes of what we are now doing, which is an interesting aside, which would make him a prophet, specifically a prophet downloading information from elsewhere to warn humanity of the way they should not go forward.
Yet the last thing he told me, you know, this business that the psychoneutronic gun was going to save the world, and the scientists are all getting together, and they've invited him to Amsterdam. He was convincing. And I thought, I bet if I open his bag, there's a plane ticket in there, and you're going to Amsterdam next week.
People claim to remember past lives. I claim to remember a different, very different present life. I know of no one who has ever made this claim before, but I rather suspect that my experience is not unique. What perhaps is unique is the fact that I am willing to talk about it.
Maybe he was lucid. He was literally lucid in the sense he was seeing through this reality into another reality. And literally, by seeing that other reality, it may have actually drove him slightly crazy. But then again, if we were perceiving a world that he was perceiving, would you not also go, as we would call it, crazy?
Sometimes I wondered whether he was testing out a new plot on me, or maybe he's really crazy. I just never quite knew. So he kept me really on my toes.
At that time, I had no idea what I was seeing. It resembled nothing that I had ever heard described. It resembled plasmic energy. It had colors. It moved fast. It collected and then dispersed.
Phil became convinced that this voice in his head, this manifestation that had been with him all his life, was eventually to manifest itself more fully in his life during what he called his 2-3-74 experiences, where he called it Valis, he called it artificial intelligence, he called it Sophia. He had many terms for it.
In '74, there came upon me at the trough of my life, at the point where I saw nothing but inexplicable suffering. There came to me the beatific vision, which calmed all my sense of horror at the world. The divine power that I perceived as master of this world was either cruel, wanton, blind, insensible, destructive, or evil.
Yeah, I think I got the call in the evening. I'm thinking around 7, 8 o'clock at night. And he said he was being interviewed, and his vision was failing. And the fellow interviewing him was saying, "You don't want to see the truth," or "You don't want to see this," whatever their topic was. And that's when I said, "Phil, you want to see the emergency room is what you want to see. You know, this is not something to intellectualize. This is something to deal with in a very real way." And he swore he'd go.
Tessa witnessed some of the extraordinary experiences that happened to Phil. Tessa experienced the radio coming on when it was unplugged. Now, Tessa could have been hallucinating as well, but then if Tessa and Phil were both hallucinating, we have a folie à deux here.
It was sort of the last bit of evidence that convinced me that this really was happening.
I am the infinitude of the void, and you know me as I am. Do you believe what you saw? Do you accept that where the infinite is, I am, and where I am, there is the infinite? I said, yes. God said, and your theories are infinite, so I am there.
One of the most peculiar elements of evidence of Phil's precognition was a letter that Phil wrote in, and I will confirm the date here, on May the 9th, 1974. And in a footnote, he writes the following. "I was up to 5 a.m. on the last night. I did something I never did before. I commanded the entity to show itself to me. A sort of dreamlike period passed, then of hypnagogic images of a stark, single, horrifying scene. Inert, but not still, a man lay dead on his face, in a living room between a coffee table and the couch.
And that's how he was found the day the paramedics took him to the hospital where he died. And I can't explain any other way than to say that he remembered the future.
I haven't gone to hospitals very often, but when I heard that the next day he had had a stroke, I got in the car and went to the hospital. Not that I knew what to do when I got there, but it just seemed like the right thing. And it was painful. It just kind of like seeing a giant who had fallen, and he just, in a hospital bed with all the tubes and the wires and the beeping noises, and just, that's not you, Phil. Where's the real Phil?
What bothers me the most is that he was unable to speak, and he wanted to tell me something. So I brought in a pen and a pad of paper, but they had his right arm on a splint. So I have no idea what he wanted to say, but he really wanted to say it.
I mean, after all, you have to consider we're only made out of dust. That's admittedly not much to go on, but even considering, it's a sort of bad beginning, we're not doing too bad. So I personally have faith that even in this lousy situation we're faced with, we can make it.